In today's chilling story, we'll dive into the terrifying and unsolved case of the Long Island serial killer, a mystery that has haunted the streets of Long Island for over a decade. The tale is filled with disappearances, eerie discoveries, and haunting questions that remain unanswered. A killer, or killers, whose identity still remains hidden in the shadows, preying on vulnerable victims. Despite years of investigation, public outcry, and the involvement of numerous law enforcement agencies, the identity of the Long Island serial killer is still unknown. But what makes this case even more chilling is the possibility that the killer might still be out there, watching, waiting. This is not just the story of a killer. It's a story about the forgotten lives of the victims, the tireless search for justice, and the unnerving silence that surrounds a crime spree that has yet to be solved. The bodies of several women were discovered along the isolated roads of Long Island, but there's a pattern behind the gruesome discoveries, one that law enforcement and amateur sleuths have been trying to decode for years. How did these women come to meet their tragic end? Was the killer someone with a deep knowledge of the area, someone who carefully planned these murders? Or did the victims unknowingly walk into a carefully laid trap? The question of whether the killer has since stopped or simply moved on continues to haunt everyone involved. Join us as we uncover the chilling details of the Long Island serial killer case and take a closer look at the victims, the investigation, and the countless theories that surround this unsolved mystery. The Long Island serial killer case began with a discovery so eerie it would haunt the region for years. It all started in May of 2010, when a search for a missing woman led investigators to uncover a series of remains along a desolate stretch of road known as Ocean Parkway, near Gilgo Beach. The missing woman, Shannon Gilbert, had been a 24-year-old escort who had disappeared in the area the previous year. Her disappearance prompted an intensive search, which ultimately revealed far more than anyone had expected. At first, the police had no idea that they were about to uncover one of the most chilling serial killer cases in American history. As they combed through the area, a series of skeletal remains emerged from the brush, hidden under the undergrowth and scattered across the lonely terrain. In total, the bodies of 4 women were uncovered, each connected by a tragic similarity. They had all been strangled and discarded in a similar manner, their bodies left in a region where few would tread. What started as a search for one missing woman quickly evolved into a full-scale investigation, as police realized they were dealing with a much larger case. The victims were later identified as Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Amber Lynn Costello, and Megan Waterman. Each of them had worked as escorts, and it became clear that they had been lured to the area under the false promise of meeting a potential client. The discovery of these women's bodies immediately pointed to the possibility of a serial killer operating in Long Island. But the story didn't end there. Just weeks after the initial discovery, a 5th victim was found. And this time, it was not just a body. The remains of Shannon Gilbert, the missing woman, were uncovered not far from where the other victims had been found. While her body was not initially linked to the same killer, her case sparked an even deeper sense of dread. She had been the one to alert 911 in a frantic call, screaming about being chased. Was her death related to the same person responsible for the other 4 women? Or had she fallen victim to something else entirely? The questions only deepened the mystery. As more bodies were discovered over the years, including additional remains in the same vicinity, it became clear that the killer had been active for a much longer time than anyone had realized. The isolated location of the bodies suggested that the killer knew the area well, and with each new discovery, the chilling realization set in. The Long Island serial killer was still at large, and the question of whether the bodies had been dumped in a calculated manner or merely left by chance would torment investigators for years to come. But one thing was certain: the truth behind these women's deaths was far from simple. As the search for clues continued, so did the growing terror surrounding the case. And the haunting question remained: who was the Long Island serial killer? And when would he strike again? Behind every case of a serial killer lies the tragic stories of the victims. Individuals whose lives were taken far too soon. The women found along Ocean Parkway were not just nameless figures. They had families, friends, dreams, and aspirations. Their deaths were not just statistics in a chilling mystery, but human lives that were cut short in a brutal and heartless manner. To understand the magnitude of the tragedy, it's crucial to take a closer look at these women, their lives before they became victims, and the lasting impact their deaths have had on those who loved them. Melissa Barthelemy was the first victim identified in connection with the Long Island killings. A 24-year-old woman from the Bronx, Melissa had been working as an escort when she vanished in July 2009. Known to be a loving daughter and sister, her family was devastated by her disappearance. Melissa's mother, Deborah, relentlessly campaigned for answers, holding out hope that her daughter would be found alive. Tragically, Melissa's remains were discovered along Ocean Parkway in December 2010, just a few months after her disappearance. Her murder was a heartbreaking blow, not just to her family, but to the community that had been following her case. Maureen Brainerd Barnes, a 25-year-old from Connecticut, was another victim who had vanished under mysterious circumstances. Maureen's family described her as a kind and caring woman, someone who had dreams of a better life. She had been working as an escort to make ends meet, a choice that would ultimately lead her down a dangerous path. Maureen was last seen in July 2007, and her remains were found a few years later. Her case was deeply troubling for her loved ones, as they were left wondering how someone could take advantage of Maureen's vulnerable situation and end her life so cruelly. Amber Lynn Costello, 27, was another victim who tragically found herself caught in a deadly cycle of despair. Amber had struggled with addiction in her past and had turned to sex work to survive. Described by her family as someone with a warm heart, Amber had hopes of escaping the dangerous world she found herself in. She went missing in 2010, shortly before the remains of other victims were discovered. Her body was found along the same stretch of road as the others, and her family was left grappling with the reality of her untimely death. Amber's story, like the others, highlighted the vulnerability of women in the sex trade and how easily their lives could be discarded without a second thought. Megan Waterman, the youngest of the victims, was just 22 years old when she disappeared in 2010. Megan had been working as an escort, a decision that ultimately led her to meet her untimely end. A native of Maine, Megan had moved to Long Island in search of work. Her family remembers her as a fun-loving, ambitious woman, and they were devastated when they learned that she had become another victim of the Long Island serial killer. Megan's remains were found not far from the others, adding another layer of heartbreak to an already complex and horrific case. Shannon Gilbert, the woman whose disappearance first brought attention to the area, was also part of the tragic narrative. A 24-year-old from Jersey City, Shannon's 911 call had sent investigators on a frantic search for her in 2010. In her call, Shannon claimed she was being chased and was in immediate danger. However, despite extensive searches, her body was not discovered until 2011, when it was found in the same area as the other victims. While Shannon's death was initially thought to be accidental due to drowning, the circumstances surrounding her death raised more questions than answers. Was she another victim of the same killer, or had her case been unrelated? The ambiguity surrounding Shannon's death has only added to the growing mystery. Each of these women, though their lives were marred by hardship, had the right to live without fear. They were not just victims. They were daughters, sisters, and mothers, and their deaths left a permanent scar on their families and loved ones. The more we learn about them, the more we realize that they were more than just faceless names in a police report. Their stories deserve to be heard. As the investigation continues, it's important to remember the victims, to honor their memories, and to acknowledge the pain their families still endure. These women's deaths may have been senseless and tragic, but by telling their stories, we ensure that they are not forgotten. The search for justice continues, not just for the victims, but for the families who live every day with the grief of losing a loved one in such a brutal, unexplained way. The discovery of the bodies along Ocean Parkway was just the beginning of a complex, unsettling investigation that has lasted for over a decade. What initially seemed like a routine missing persons case quickly spiraled into something much darker. As the remains of multiple victims were found, the case began to take on the characteristics of a serial killer investigation, but with a crucial twist. No one could determine who the killer was or why the bodies were dumped in such a calculated manner. The first break in the case came when the police linked the remains to several women who had been working as escorts. This revelation led to a series of questions. Were these women specifically targeted because of their lifestyle, or was the killer simply using their vulnerability to carry out his crimes? Early on, investigators suspected that the killer was local to the area, perhaps someone familiar with the geography and secluded locations where the bodies were found. The remote, desolate stretch of Ocean Parkway near Gilgo Beach seemed like an intentional dumping ground, indicating that the killer knew how to navigate the area's isolated spots. The Suffolk County Police, along with the FBI, were quick to start piecing together the evidence. But what they didn't expect was the level of complexity that the case would develop into. The investigation seemed to go in circles, with false leads, public speculation, and high-profile media attention all adding layers of confusion to an already convoluted case. In the midst of the chaos, law enforcement struggled to identify any solid leads or potential suspects. A significant challenge in the investigation was the discovery of Shannon Gilbert's remains, which initially seemed unrelated to the other victims. Shannon had been the one to call 911 in a frantic state, reporting that someone was chasing her. That 911 call would become a pivotal moment in the case, but despite extensive searches for her, it took over a year to find her body. Her death was initially thought to be an accident. She had apparently drowned in a marshy area. But over time, the circumstances surrounding her disappearance raised further questions. Was Shannon another victim of the Long Island serial killer? Or had her death been unrelated, the result of a different, unfortunate situation? The ambiguity surrounding Shannon's death added to the complexity of the case. Investigators struggled to find any clear connection between her and the other victims. Some speculated that she had been involved with the same killer, and her frantic 911 call may have been the final desperate plea of a woman who knew she was in immediate danger. Others believed that her death was a result of misfortune, and that the killer had stopped after Shannon's disappearance. The idea of a local killer began to take root as more victims were found, and law enforcement's focus shifted toward anyone with inside knowledge of the area. The killer appeared to understand the geography of Long Island intimately, using its remote, secluded roads to carry out his gruesome work. Investigators began to consider the possibility that the killer may have even worked within law enforcement or had connections to the Suffolk County Police, someone who would have had the means and knowledge to avoid detection. Could the killer have been hiding in plain sight? As the investigation continued, several potential suspects were brought into the spotlight, though none were ever definitively linked to the crimes. One of the most controversial moments in the investigation came when police publicly discussed a possible connection to James Bissett, a former law enforcement officer who had worked in the area. While he was never formally charged, speculation around his involvement persisted, and he became the subject of intense media scrutiny. Despite the wealth of theories, the investigation never resulted in a breakthrough. The killer's identity remained elusive, and law enforcement's inability to solve the case left a lingering sense of fear and frustration in the community. The public's growing interest in the case, fueled by online forums, documentaries, and true crime enthusiasts, only seemed to complicate matters. Everyone had a theory, but no one had the answers. The Suffolk County Police, though initially criticized for their handling of the case, eventually enlisted the help of the FBI in the hope of bringing fresh expertise to the investigation. New forensic methods, including DNA analysis, geographic profiling, and digital tracking, were all explored. Yet, despite the advancements in criminal investigation, the identity of the Long Island serial killer remained shrouded in mystery. For years, investigators chased down leads, but the breakthrough they desperately needed never came. Each new discovery, whether it was a piece of evidence, a witness account, or a potential suspect, only led to more questions and no answers. The frustration of law enforcement, the victims' families, and the public became palpable as the years passed without any concrete leads or resolutions. The case grew colder, but the sense of unease never disappeared. The killer or killers remained at large, and the questions surrounding the Long Island serial killer continued to torment those who sought justice for the victims. What had started as a missing persons case had turned into one of the most infamous unsolved mysteries of our time. As the investigation into the Long Island serial killer case stretched on, numerous theories emerged, each more chilling than the last. For years, the question remained: who was the killer, and why were these women targeted? Theories about the killer's identity, motivations, and methods became the subject of intense public debate, with each new lead adding to the growing complexity of the case. Could the killer still be active, or had he simply vanished into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and eerie silence? One of the most prominent theories is that the Long Island serial killer is a local resident, someone who is intimately familiar with the area's isolated geography. The bodies were found along Ocean Parkway and surrounding areas, locations that are not only difficult to access, but also remote enough to avoid detection. This suggested that the killer had extensive knowledge of the area and its hidden paths. Investigators began to suspect that the killer could be someone with a deep connection to Long Island, possibly someone who had lived there for years or worked in the area, such as a local business owner or even a law enforcement officer. The remoteness of the dumping sites seemed to indicate a level of confidence that only a local could have. But while many considered the possibility of a local killer, there were also those who wondered if there might be more than one killer at work. Some theorists proposed that the Long Island serial killer could be a collection of individuals who operated independently, each taking advantage of the vulnerable women in their own way. This theory was particularly fueled by the fact that the bodies of the victims had been discovered in various stages of decomposition, suggesting different timelines of death. Could there have been multiple perpetrators working in tandem, or was it a case of isolated individuals operating in the same area? Several key suspects have come under the microscope during the investigation, but none have been definitively linked to the crimes. One of the most controversial figures was James Bissett, a former law enforcement officer. Bissett, who had worked in Suffolk County during the time of the killings, came under suspicion due to his close ties to the area and his access to law enforcement resources. While he was never charged or arrested, the speculation surrounding him was enough to raise questions about the potential involvement of someone within law enforcement. Had the killer been hiding in plain sight, using his position to cover up his crimes? Another possible suspect, who became the subject of much public attention, was Rex Heuermann, a New York architect. Heuermann was investigated by law enforcement in connection to the killings, and rumors surrounding his involvement in the case circulated widely. However, no concrete evidence was found that tied Heuermann to the murders, and he was never formally charged with any crimes related to the Long Island serial killer case. While Heuermann remains a person of interest, the investigation into his potential involvement has not led to any breakthroughs. The internet sleuths and true crime communities have played an interesting role in the ongoing investigation, with many amateur detectives taking matters into their own hands. Websites like Reddit and web sleuths became hotbeds for speculation, as people from all over the world tried to piece together the clues. Some amateur sleuths focused on the victims, their lives, and their interactions with clients, while others looked into the history of the area itself, examining previous cases that could be linked to the Long Island serial killer. Although some of the theories put forward by online detectives were outlandish and even dangerous, others have helped to shed light on potential leads, though none have conclusively solved the case. Despite the wealth of theories, the case remains frustratingly unsolved, with no solid evidence to conclusively identify the killer. Law enforcement's inability to pinpoint a suspect has left many wondering if the killer is still out there, watching, waiting, perhaps even taunting the investigation with each passing year. Could the killer have stopped? Or did he simply find a new location to continue his gruesome work? The fear that he could still be active continues to haunt the community, especially those living in Suffolk County, where many of the murders took place. Some investigators have suggested that the killer's method, luring victims from the world of sex work, points to a psychological profile common among serial killers. The idea is that the killer's motivations go beyond just the act of murder. It's about control, manipulation, and the predatory nature of his actions. This theory proposes that the killer derives satisfaction not just from the act of killing, but from the power he wields over the victims, exploiting their vulnerabilities and using their lives as pawns in a larger, sinister game. What remains clear is that, despite numerous theories, suspects, and advancements in forensic science, the Long Island serial killer case remains one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in criminal history. The lack of answers has only fueled speculation and fear, leaving a lingering darkness over the community. Will the killer ever be caught? Or will this case become yet another example of a mystery that is destined to remain unsolved, with the true identity of the killer hiding forever in the shadows? As the years passed, the search for the Long Island serial killer continued, but the investigation seemed to stall at every turn. The victims' families and the public were left wondering whether the killer would ever be brought to justice. The lack of arrests, the tangled web of theories, and the seeming inability of law enforcement to make any significant breakthroughs only added to the frustration and pain of those affected by the case. The Suffolk County Police Department, once under heavy criticism for their handling of the investigation, found themselves under increasing pressure from both the public and the victims' families. The pressure to solve the case grew with every passing year. In the absence of answers, the case became a symbol of the dark side of law enforcement, the failure to protect vulnerable individuals, and the deep fears of living in a community where a killer lurked in the shadows, unknown and unpunished. In recent years, there have been glimmers of hope that the case may not be as cold as it seems. The advent of new technology, particularly advances in forensic science, has reignited hope among investigators and the families of the victims. DNA testing has come a long way since the early days of the investigation, and the potential for breakthroughs in the case is still very much a possibility. Even the smallest piece of evidence, perhaps overlooked in the past, could finally provide the critical link needed to identify the killer. One of the most significant developments came in the form of genetic genealogy. This technique has been successfully used in recent years to solve cold cases, most famously leading to the identification and arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018. By using DNA samples found at the crime scene and cross-referencing them with publicly available genealogical databases, investigators can potentially trace distant relatives of the killer and work their way back to the source. This method, still relatively new, could hold the key to breaking open the Long Island serial killer case. If the killer's DNA is ever matched with someone in a database, it could provide the breakthrough that law enforcement has been desperately waiting for. Meanwhile, public interest in the case remains high. True crime documentaries, podcasts, and media coverage have kept the Long Island serial killer in the public eye, ensuring that the case is not forgotten. People around the world continue to follow every new development, no matter how small, and the families of the victims have not given up hope that the killer will eventually be brought to justice. Social media, in particular, has allowed for a new kind of public investigation, with online communities dedicated to discussing the case and sharing information. These online groups often dissect every detail of the case, analyzing evidence, following leads, and coming up with new theories. While their efforts have not led to an arrest, they have kept the story alive and reminded everyone that the victims still deserve justice. At the heart of the ongoing search for justice are the families of the victims, whose pain has never diminished. Their relentless pursuit of answers is driven by the hope that they will one day know what happened to their loved ones and who was responsible for the unimaginable loss they've endured. Deborah Barthélemy, mother of Melissa Barthélemy, has become a vocal advocate for justice, sharing her grief and frustration publicly in the hopes that it will inspire action. Maureen Brainerd Barnes's family, too, has never stopped fighting for the truth. The other families, though each dealing with their own unimaginable pain, share a united purpose: to see the killer caught and brought to justice so that their loved ones' names are not lost to history. While the police investigation continues, some experts believe that the case will eventually be solved, especially as more resources are dedicated to unsolved cases like this one. Law enforcement agencies now work together more than ever before, sharing information and cooperating across state lines. The increasing sophistication of criminal investigation methods and databases provides hope that the case will one day see closure. However, the reality is that the search for justice may take many more years. The Long Island serial killer remains elusive, but the determination of those seeking answers shows no sign of fading. The victims' families continue to wait for the day when they can finally lay their loved ones to rest with the knowledge that their killer has been caught. Until then, they will carry the burden of grief, the haunting question of who did this, and the hope that justice will eventually prevail. As we continue to reflect on this case, it's important to remember the victims and the profound impact their deaths have had on their families and communities. They were not simply names or faces in a cold case file. They were real people with lives, dreams, and futures. The Long Island serial killer case may remain unsolved for now, but the fight for justice will continue. And with each passing year, the determination to uncover the truth grows stronger. As we come to the end of this chilling case, the mystery of the Long Island serial killer remains unresolved, and the questions surrounding the killer's identity continue to haunt the families of the victims, law enforcement, and the public at large. Each discovery, each theory, and each new lead adds another layer to an already complex puzzle, but the answer still eludes us. The tragic lives of the victims, women whose stories were often forgotten or dismissed, serve as a haunting reminder of how vulnerable people can be in the face of evil. They were more than just victims. They were daughters, sisters, mothers, and friends. Their stories deserve to be remembered, and their families deserve answers. Though the search for justice has not ended, the strength of the victims' loved ones and the persistence of the public's interest ensure that this case will not fade into obscurity. The journey to uncover the truth is far from over, and we must all continue to stand in solidarity with the families who have waited so long for justice. We may not have the answers today, but every new piece of evidence, every bit of information shared, brings us one step closer to unveiling the killer's identity. Until that day comes, we are left with the hope that the Long Island serial killer will be caught, and the victims will finally receive the justice they deserve. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into one of the most chilling, unsolved mysteries of our time. If you have any information, any thoughts, or any theories of your own, we encourage you to share them. The search for justice needs all the help it can get. Keep the victims' names alive and never stop seeking the truth. This has been another episode of The Hidden Truth, True Crime Story. Stay tuned, stay vigilant, and most importantly, keep seeking the truth.